at the core of SpaceX's Hawthorne facility, past the pristine glass-walled conference rooms, through the controlled chaos of the engineering bay, and down a corridor known jokingly as the Vortex, there was a quiet lab filled with chalk dust and impossibly elegant math. This space didn't buzz like the others. It thrummed low and constant, like the background hum of a quantum machine always computing. And at its center was Dr. Elena Reyes. Brilliance wasn't rare at SpaceX, it was the baseline. But Elena, she was different. A theoretical physicist by training and an aerospace systems architect by demand, she'd once been labeled a once-in-a-century intellect by MIT's mathematics chair. Recruited straight out of Caltech after a surprise keynote dismantled a long-held assumption about gravitational harmonics in low Earth orbit, she had initially hesitated to join the company. Academia had its limits, but it also had rules, predictable walls she could bounce off of. SpaceX was something else. Raw, demanding, wild, beautiful. Elon Musk didn't woo her with a salary or a mission statement. He brought her to a hangar at midnight, rolled up his sleeves, and handed her a piece of chalk. "I want to show you where we're wrong," he said. For hours later, the whiteboard was a blur of logic loops and orbital corrections. By dawn, he was grinning and silent. Elena said nothing. She just handed back the chalk. From that night on, she never really left. Her official title was Senior Theoretical Systems Engineer, but around the company, people simply referred to her as the woman who could see around corners. Her workspace was a contradiction, cluttered with post-it notes, yet ordered by concepts only she could track. One wall was covered entirely in black chalk paint, covered in equations that looked like constellations frozen mid-motion. She wrote without looking at her hand, often talking to herself in low murmurs, as if solving the math with sound as much as sight. Elon admired her fiercely. In meetings, when someone said, "That's impossible," he would lean back and ask, "Has Elena looked at it?" He often described her as someone whose brain ran on a different frequency, like she was decoding a transmission the rest of the world didn't even know existed. They rarely spoke casually, but their communication was tight, precise, and built on mutual respect. He'd drop by her lab at odd hours, asking, "Are we still within Earth's arrogance zone?" And she'd laugh, tossing him an updated vector sheet or a half-sketched combustion map. But genius, as it turned out, carried gravity. Elena's co-workers admired her work, but they didn't understand her silences, or her sudden shifts in tone, or the way she sometimes paused mid-sentence, eyes distant, as if someone had whispered something only she could hear. The signs were there, subtle, quiet. It started with gaps in memory, formulas scribbled in her own hand that she didn't recall writing. Then came the late nights, when she'd stay in the lab long after everyone else had gone, muttering equations to the wall. When someone asked her who she was talking to, she blinked like the question didn't make sense. "Feedback loop," she'd say, trying to catch the echo. But then it escalated. One afternoon, an intern walked in on her arguing, fiercely, passionately, with no one. She stood, back-turned, pointing at the board, debating something in such technical detail that he took notes, thinking it was part of a lesson. Only when she turned around and asked, "Did she leave already?" did he realize there was no one else there. People whispered, but they didn't report it. She was Elena Reyes. She got results. And no one wanted to be the one to question the genius. But Elon noticed. He always noticed. After a tense orbital mechanics review, one where Elena had completely dismissed a risk that turned out to be real, he called her into his office. Not for a reprimand, for a conversation. "You're burning too hot," he said. She stared at him, pale and shaking. "I don't know how to cool down without losing signal," she replied. That night, she returned to her apartment and tried to sleep. But the tapping started again. It was always rhythmic, precise, like Morse code coming from the inside of her window pane. She lived alone on the 11th floor. No trees, no wind. Tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. She sat up in bed, notebook already in hand, scribbling what she could remember. The symbols came quickly, fully formed. She couldn't explain how she knew them. They felt familiar, like echoes from a dream. Then came the voice. Female, Soft, warm, almost motherly. Keep going. They're watching. Elena didn't scream. She didn't panic. She nodded, and she wrote faster. The next morning, she arrived at work early. The sun hadn't risen yet. No one was in the lab. She filled the chalk wall with vectors she couldn't fully explain. They solved the problem SpaceX had been grappling with for weeks: thrust calibration on asymmetric entry. When Elon reviewed it later that day, he called her. "Elena, how did you?" She cut him off. "It came to me. Late." He hesitated. "Who's they?" She didn't answer, because in that moment, she didn't know if he meant the engineers or the voices. She only knew one thing: they were helping her, and she couldn't afford to lose them. Not yet. The signs were subtle at first, so subtle that even Elena dismissed them as quirks of exhaustion. A misplaced decimal in her trajectory calculations. A half-finished formula scribbled on the margin of her legal pad in handwriting that seemed just slightly off. She'd always been a nonlinear thinker, prone to intuitive leaps and midnight breakthroughs, so these lapses didn't initially concern her. But slowly, a dissonance began to build. She would find pages in her notebook, dense, theoretical structures that she didn't remember writing. Not just messy thoughts or late-night scrawls, but entire proofs. Polished, deliberate, some of them brilliant, some of them terrifying. At first, she blamed overwork, deadlines, stress, the pressure of leading a division where even microscopic errors could mean millions lost or lives at risk. But the anomalies crept into her days like static in a signal, low, then rising. It began with people. A woman in the hallway, older, wearing a green lanyard Elena didn't recognize, smiled at her one morning and said in accented Spanish, "They still trust you." That's rare. Elena paused mid-step, puzzled, and turned back to ask who she was. The hallway was empty. Another time during a coffee break, a man she didn't know leaned in, nodded at the headline on her tablet, "Mars Orbital Decay Simulation Falters in Final Phase," and said, "You'll fix it. You always do." She looked up to question him, but no one stood nearby. Just two engineers buried in their laptops across the break room. And then came the dreams. They weren't surreal or symbolic. They were equations, reams of them, unfurling in perfect, scrolling lines. Elena would wake with her hands clenched into fists, whispering solutions to problems she hadn't encountered yet. Sometimes she'd rush to write them down and find that they were already there, already recorded days before in a notebook she didn't remember opening. It wasn't until a mission readiness review for the Oberon payload, a high-risk, deep-orbit test flight, that things came to a head. During the simulation debrief, Elena had contradicted her team's delta-V calculations without referencing a single data point. "The drift compensation isn't real," she said flatly, eyes fixed on the screen. "It's a phantom load. We're solving for something that doesn't exist." The room went silent. "Dr. Reyes," one engineer asked carefully, "which model are you referencing?" Elena blinked. She hesitated. I think it came from the August batch." "There is no August batch," someone whispered. Later that day, Musk called her into his office. His tone wasn't accusatory, just curious, concerned. "You're pushing yourself too hard," he said, gently but firmly. He stood at the window as he spoke, not looking at her, giving her space. "I've seen it before. People working at the edge of possibility sometimes start seeing ghosts." She smiled. "Forced. Aren't we all? SpaceX is just the most expensive haunted house in California." He didn't laugh. "Elena," he said, turning toward her, "I'm serious." She nodded. "I know. So am I." But that night, the tapping began. Soft at first, like rain against a glass, but more deliberate. Rhythmic. Top o pause. Tap. Elena lived alone in a high-rise downtown, far from the noise of traffic, her 11th-floor apartment wrapped in silence and dark steel. No trees, no scaffolding, nothing that could produce such a sound from outside her window. She stood in the center of her living room, barefoot, staring at the pane. Her reflection blinked back at her, pale, hollow-eyed, framed by a cityscape of lights that flickered like code, waiting to execute. Tap. Pause. Tap, tap. She approached the glass. No one was there. Still, the tapping continued, like the sound was inside her bones now. She stepped back, grabbed a pen, a notebook. She sat at the kitchen counter and began to write, not words, but numbers. Matrices, Fourier transforms, vector fields that spread out across the page like spiderwebs. The rhythm had become math. The silence had become signal. For 3 hours, she wrote. When she finally stopped, the notebook was filled, line after line of impossibly complex mathematics. But as she stared at the final page, her heart caught. She hadn't just recorded equations. She'd written a message, a short, chilling line at the bottom of the final sheet, written in her own unmistakable handwriting. They are waiting in the orbitals. Elena dropped the pen. For the first time in her life, she felt afraid of her own mind. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in her chair, staring at the window, waiting for the tapping to return. But it didn't. Only the wind passed. Only the silence held. In the morning, she returned to work. She smiled at her team, replied to emails, delivered a flawless presentation on periapsis modulation for Mars return missions. No one suspected a thing. But in her bag, the notebook pulsed like a second heart. And when she passed the break room, she saw the man again, the one from before. He looked at her, smiled faintly, and whispered, "It's not madness, Elena. It's compression." She turned. He was gone. Despite the growing fragmentation in her thoughts, Dr. Elena Reyes remained the beating heart of SpaceX's theoretical division. While most engineers moved within the rails of proven models and inherited systems, Elena veered into unmapped territories. Orbital decay, micro-thrust stabilization, phase alignment across distant planetary bodies. She was solving problems SpaceX hadn't even known it had. And the pace, it was blistering. In meetings, her ideas were often so far ahead that by the time her colleagues caught up, the solution was already prototyped. Her colleagues whispered admiration behind closed doors. Some called it genius. Others called it intuition. Musk, however, had a different term. "She's the anomaly," he said once to a board member. "Statistically unrepeatable. We don't explain her, we just listen when she speaks." But Elena wasn't sure the voice she spoke with was always hers anymore. It began to happen during quiet moments when her conscious thoughts were elsewhere. The voice of a woman older, gentle, and vaguely familiar would offer input, suggestions, warnings. At first, Elena assumed she was internalizing stress or creating mental placeholders for ideas. But the voice began to take shape. Accented, European, possibly Catalan, though it shifted subtly. Elena was Spanish, born in Madrid, and there was something almost maternal about the voice's tone. Calm, supportive, deliberate. "We're depending on you," it whispered one night as she stared at her wall of notes. "You're solving problems the others can't see, because you're not bound by their present." Elena froze. "Who are you?" she whispered aloud. No answer. But the following morning, when she returned to her lab, a fresh equation had appeared on her whiteboard. She had no recollection of writing it, but the marker was dry, and her handwriting was unmistakable. The formula described a theoretical stabilizing field for deep space comm relays. A month later, that very structure was used to correct a signal drift in the Ether prototype. It wasn't an isolated event. More notes began to appear, sometimes on her whiteboards, sometimes tucked inside her notebooks, and occasionally written in dry erase marker on the bathroom mirror. Always her own handwriting, always dense, always useful. At first, she laughed them off as fugue-state inspirations. But as the messages became more frequent and more conversational, Elena stopped laughing. She started answering them. In a corner of her apartment, she dedicated an entire wall to the future department, as the voice called it. It was layered with diagrams, sticky notes, pins connecting theories with red thread. It looked like the workspace of a conspiracy theorist. And in some ways it was. Only this conspiracy was hers. And it was working. In 1 week, she developed a novel interpolation method that eliminated a 3% margin of error in SpaceX's orbital predictions, something no one else on the team had even attempted. Another time, she created a 3-page model explaining how to simulate real-time gravitational flux for proximity landings on Phobos, Mars' unstable moon. Musk was floored. "You coded that out of thin air?" he asked. "More like thin time," she joked, but her eyes said something different. She began to wonder, what if the voice wasn't madness? What if it was access? Elon called her into a strategy meeting for a mission codenamed Solstice. It was theoretical, planning for a satellite deployment in the asteroid belt. Elon outlined the problem: too many variables, unpredictable shifts in mass density, possible interference from solar wind patterns. Elena listened silently, then opened her notebook. "This is a long shot," she said, handing him a handwritten page. It was a solution using counter-rotational thrusters and a predictive AI model based on gravitational memory, something no one had ever mentioned. Musk stared at the page for a long time. "Where did this come from?" he asked. "I dreamed it," she said flatly. He smiled, not fully believing her, but accepting it anyway. "Your dreams are expensive," he muttered. Back in her apartment, the voice became more active. "You're not delusional," it told her. "You're just tuned differently. They don't hear it because they're not built to." "Built to hear what?" she asked one night aloud. "The future," the voice said. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. She walked to her apartment window and looked out over the lights of Los Angeles. The city below pulsed like a motherboard. In her mind, the world had become a system, code she was meant to debug. And somehow, she wasn't alone in the task. A second mind had formed. It wasn't separate. It didn't argue. It co-authored. It helped. And yet, Elena was terrified. Not of losing her position. Not of the pressure. Not even of Elon, though his expectations were colossal. She was terrified that if she told anyone, especially Musk, he'd stop trusting her. He'd see her not as brilliant, but as broken. So she smiled in meetings. She offered jokes when asked if she slept. She masked the fact that her apartment now resembled the inside of a brain trying to externalize itself onto the walls. But every night, she kept writing. Sometimes, she wrote notes to herself. Other times, it felt like she was taking dictation from something just beyond the veil of comprehension. She stopped caring where the knowledge came from, only that it came, and that it kept coming. Elon Musk had seen brilliance take many forms, some dazzling, others volatile. He'd worked alongside geniuses who saw the world in lines of code, or in propellant ratios, or in market shifts before anyone else could. But none of them unsettled him like Dr. Elena Reyes. It wasn't her intellect. He revered that. It was her presence. Lately, she developed a kind of stillness, not the calm of a mind at work, but the eerie hush of a system running too many simultaneous processes. She no longer responded to jokes. She didn't blink when a prototype exploded during a test review. She stared through engineers as if she were watching simulations behind their skulls. And when she did speak, her words were precise, yet strangely detached. Not arrogant, just elsewhere. It had been building for weeks. Her reports were still brilliant, some of the best theoretical work SpaceX had ever seen. She was solving orbital instability, problems no one could even model. And yet, the emotional latency in her interactions was unmistakable. The way she moved, calculated, spoke, it was like she was in two realities at once. Her eyes flickered when no one was speaking. Her hands trembled just slightly when idle. And sometimes Elon caught her murmuring as if replying to someone he couldn't see. He had to know what was happening. So he scheduled a closed-door meeting with her, calling it a trajectory brainstorm. No assistants, no timekeepers, just the two of them, like in the early days when Elena had written equations on chalkboards until sunrise. She welcomed him in with a quiet nod, not the usual smile. Her office, once neat and modern, was now a dense forest of data. Papers were stacked on every flat surface, many without labels. There were notebooks filled edge to edge, and her walls were no longer white, but gray with overlapping diagrams, handwritten formulas, and strange flowcharts shaped like trees growing sideways. She began pacing the room the moment he sat down, talking rapidly, not to him, but at the space around him. She spoke of non-local resonance, of cooperative harmonics between predictive timelines, and something called the inversion hypothesis. Musk followed pieces, but not the thread. Her theories looped on themselves, recursive and abstract, like watching a fractal unfold. Then, abruptly, she stopped. She turned to the whiteboard, lifted a marker, and stared at a diagram that resembled a solar system wrapped in audio waveforms. "They're watching from the orbitals," she said. Elon sat forward slightly. "Who's watching?" Her eyes lit with eerie clarity. "The variables." She turned to him, like that answer explained everything. He studied her for a long second. "Elena, are you hearing voices again?" She didn't flinch. "Not voices. Patterns. They're embedded. Like code inside code." "Elena," he kept his voice gentle, "you're not alone. But this sounds like something more than inspiration." "I'm not broken," she said suddenly sharply. "I'm tuned differently. That's all." He stood slowly. "You're not broken," he echoed, "but you might be burning too fast." She didn't reply. She simply turned back to the board and began writing a new formula, one he couldn't recognize. That evening, Elon didn't go home. He sat in his office, long after the halls had gone quiet, reviewing her work from the last 2 quarters. He asked his assistant to bring him every draft, every back-channel memo, every unfiled schematic she'd submitted to internal teams. What he found was unnerving. Brilliant, yes, but laced with metaphors. She had stopped naming her modules in numbers. Now they had titles like Observer, Echo Relay, Thread Oracle. She was talking to the system like it was sentient, and in return, it seemed to be guiding her. He picked up his phone and dialed Matt, an old friend, a cognitive neuroscientist who'd once helped SpaceX screen high-pressure rolls for early psychological collapse. "I need you," Elon said, quietly. Matt's voice came groggy. "Who?" "Elena Reyes." "That's your theoretical lead, right? What's going on?" "She's accelerating past the safe point," Elon said. "She's writing code that looks like language. She's describing orbital patterns like their voices." "Schizophrenia?" "I don't know. It's high-functioning, whatever it is. And it's effective, terrifyingly effective. She's solving problems no one else can. But it's costing her." Matt sighed. "Do you want me to come in?" "No, not yet. I need to understand what this is first. I need to protect her." And that was the core of it. Elon wasn't just worried about losing a mind. He was worried about losing her. Not the data, not the output, but the person inside it, the quiet, brilliant Spanish scientist who once challenged a lunar return model on a napkin just to prove it could be better. Back at her apartment that night, Elena stood barefoot at her wall of notes, adding new lines with a red pen. The voice, the woman, was back. Not in sound, but in thought. "We're depending on you," it said again. She nodded. On her whiteboard, she wrote a phrase in delicate script. "If they're watching from the orbitals, we must build a language they understand." She stepped back. Her second mind approved. The shadows started with movement, just movement. Quick flashes in her peripheral vision while reviewing telemetry data. A figure slipping past the threshold of the test bay. A silhouette frozen briefly between stacks of turbine parts. At first, Elena thought it was fatigue, a trick of the eye. The kind of glitch anyone might experience after 36 straight hours of orbital modeling. But then they stayed longer. During late-night calibration runs, she began to see them more clearly. Human forms, neither solid nor spectral, just present enough to feel real, yet not enough to speak. Some wore lab coats. Others were faceless outlines, hovering at the edge of her field of vision like corrupted files on a visual feed. One of them always stood closest, tall, motionless, silent. That one unnerved her most. They never threatened her. Not directly. Instead, they whispered. Not with voices, but with data. Coordinates would appear suddenly in her mind, angles and vectors she couldn't recall calculating. Warnings sometimes about thruster delays or timing loops. At first she resisted. She dismissed them as hallucinations, the fraying edges of a brilliant but overloaded mind. But then the warnings started to make sense. Then they started to work. One night, during a low-atmosphere hover test of the Falcon module, the onboard telemetry flagged a minor anomaly. The team considered it negligible, a rounding error in fuel efficiency. But Elena felt something else. Something from the dream she couldn't remember, except for the numbers: 14.7 minus 88.3, 3 minutes and 21 seconds. She jolted upright in her seat and overrode the system with an emergency reroute of the thruster configuration. The command was issued just in time. 3 seconds later, the Falcon spun violently, but recovered without damage. The anomaly had been real, and her instinct, no, the whisper, had saved the mission. The team praised her foresight, called it Elena's sixth sense. Musk, however, remained quiet. He didn't like coincidences, especially when they repeated. Later that week, he called her into his office again. Not in anger, just unease. He didn't have the vocabulary for what he was seeing, but his gut told him something was off. He'd trusted brilliance before and watched it collapse into flames. This time, he wanted to act before it reached the point of no return. The office was quiet when Elena entered. No assistants, just Elon sitting at his minimalist desk, hands folded. "Sit," he said simply. She sat. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, "I trust your instincts." A pause. "But are they yours?" Elena blinked. "That's an odd question." "Is it?" he replied. "You pulled numbers out of a dream that saved a prototype. You've been logging coordinates with no origin. You've been speaking to no one." She forced a laugh. "I talk to myself all the time. That's where my best arguments happen." "Elena," he said gently, "this isn't a performance review." She looked down at her hands. They were trembling slightly, betraying the calm her voice projected. In her mind, the tall shadow stood behind Musk, silent and watchful. "I don't know," she said quietly. "Maybe I'm just too far inside the data." He nodded slowly, as if granting her that illusion, but not accepting it. "I want to help you," he said. "Not diagnose, not remove, just help." She hesitated, then reached into her satchel and pulled out one of her journals. Leather-bound, its edges worn from years of use. She slid it across the desk. Elon opened it. Inside were pages of pure genius, diagrams, annotations, radical theoretical expansions on orbital slingshot efficiency. But beneath the brilliance, there was something else. Scribbled notes in the margins, conversations transcribed between her and the voices. Questions written in ink, answers that weren't hers. "Why do they call me the bridge?" "Because you hold both realities." "What happens if I stop listening?" "Then we stop guiding." Elon turned the page, then another, and another. The handwriting was always hers, but some sections looked unrecognizable. A style shift, a different pressure in the pen strokes, dual authorship. When he finally closed the book, his expression was unreadable. "We need help," he said at last. "Not punishment, not judgment, just a system update." She chuckled softly. "Are you diagnosing me or debugging me?" "Both," he said. "You're too important to lose." Tears welled in her eyes, but she held them back. She had feared this moment, the unveiling, the exposure. But Elon hadn't recoiled. He hadn't ordered psych evaluation or called the board. He just listened, and that was enough to keep her going. Back in her apartment that night, she sat cross-legged beneath the wall of equations. The shadows didn't come. The whispers were quiet, but her own thoughts pulsed louder than ever. She picked up her pen and began a new entry in her second journal, one she hadn't shown Elon. "They know I told him," she wrote, "but they're not angry. They're waiting." She set the pen down and whispered to no one, "What now?" No voice replied, only silence. But somehow, she knew that silence was still listening. The room where it happened was sterile, quiet, and lined with awards, framed degrees, textbooks with the neurologist's name on the spine, articles clipped from scientific journals. But none of it softened the blow. Elena sat still, hands folded too tightly, as the word left the specialist's lips like a slow incision. Paranoid schizophrenia. The diagnosis was delivered clinically, compassionately, with 100 disclaimers. High functioning, treatable, manageable. The neurologist, Dr. Kim, assured her this wasn't an ending. It was a frame, a lens, starting point. But for Elena, it felt like erasure. She barely remembered walking out. She only remembered Elon's hand at the small of her back, grounding her as the hallway swam. She didn't cry, not until later. Not until she was alone, staring at the wall of equations in her apartment and realizing none of it might be real. Not the future department, not the tapping code, not the woman's voice that had guided her through the most elegant algorithm she'd ever conceived. Had she imagined it all? Had her genius been a symptom? Elon moved fast, as he always did. He cleared her calendar, removed her from all active simulations without alerting the board. He rerouted press inquiries, citing a sabbatical for private research. He shielded her not just from the world, but from herself, quietly, respectfully, as a friend, not just a boss. "You're not broken," he told her when she finally called him in the middle of the night, sobbing into the mouthpiece. "You're running parallel processes. We just need to sync them." But the syncing hurt. Therapy began immediately, twice a week, then daily when the nightmares intensified. Elena was compliant, eager, hopeful even. She wanted to get better. She wanted to be safe, as Dr. Kim called it. But safety came with a price. The medications dulled the noise, but they dulled the signal too. For the first time in years, Elena felt ordinary, sluggish. Her mind, once a symphony of impossible connections and multidimensional insights, was now a hallway lined with closed doors. She could still remember how the equations used to feel, like light moving through glass, but now they sat stubbornly in her hands, heavy and dry. One morning, she attempted to reconstruct a simple gravitational model, something she could have done in her sleep a year ago. But it wouldn't come. The logic bent sideways, refused to snap into place. She stared at the whiteboard for hours before wiping it clean in frustration. That night, she sobbed on the floor, her fingers twitching for a pencil she no longer trusted herself to hold. "I feel muted," she told her therapist, "like I've traded genius for silence." The woman nodded slowly. That silence might be the space where you rebuild something even stronger. But Elena wasn't sure she wanted strength if it meant losing her mind's voice. Elon didn't push her to return. Instead, he visited weekly, sometimes with data sheets, sometimes with chocolate, once with an old mechanical keyboard, just in case the analog world feels less threatening. He sat quietly as she fumbled through simulations or stared blankly at open notebooks. "I can't find the spark," she admitted one day, the shadows under her eyes like bruises from thinking too hard. "It's like I turned off the part of me that made things beautiful." He leaned forward. Maybe beauty isn't in the fire. Maybe it's in surviving the burn. She almost smiled. Almost. But the truth was, she missed the hallucinations. Not because they were comforting, many weren't, but because they had felt like something meaningful, purposeful. The voice, the patterns, the strange messages, they had been maddening, yes, but they had given her a sense of mission. Now she felt like a ghost in her own lab, haunting the spaces where her mind used to dance. Her journals gathered dust. Her wall of diagrams faded. The second mind, as she called it, had gone silent. And in its absence, the real world felt louder, but also lonelier. Still, she persisted. She showed up to therapy. She took her meds. She journaled, honestly if not brilliantly. She told Dr. Kim when she felt a phantom presence and when she didn't. She practiced mindfulness even when it made her feel like she was floating in a jar. Elon, ever present, never judged her progress by output. "You don't owe anyone answers," he reminded her once during a walk around the test site. "Only presence, only the willingness to keep showing up." That stayed with her. One day, as she sat by the window of her apartment watching launch footage play on silent repeat, she noticed something odd. A blinking pattern in the fuel pressure telemetry. A rhythmic anomaly, 3 short pulses too long, 3 short. Morse code, SOS. She blinked. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. She was stabilized. She was medicated. But it was there. And for the first time in months, her fingers itched. Not to write down a formula, not to decode the message, but to listen. She retrieved a fresh notebook, the one Musk had given her months earlier, and wrote just 4 words on the first page. What if it's both? Genius and illness, noise and signal, madness and meaning. She didn't know the answer yet, but for the first time in a long time, she was willing to ask. Time, Elena discovered, had a different rhythm when your mind was healing. It didn't tick in seconds or minutes. It pulsed in moments of clarity, in breaths not shortened by panic, in silences that weren't filled with whispers. Weeks turned into months. Seasons shifted, but her days blurred like pages in a notebook soaked in rain. She wasn't sick anymore, not in the way that had nearly unraveled her, but she wasn't herself either. She was something in between. The hallucinations never fully vanished. They softened. The voice of the woman with the accent became quieter, like a memory carried on the wind. The tapping, once sharp and precise, now came only in dreams, like a song without lyrics. The shadowy figures, those silent watchers in the corners of her vision, stopped appearing at work, but would still visit her in the early hours of the morning, when sleep thinned and her thoughts grew fragile. But now she could name them. That was what therapy had taught her. Not how to erase the strange architecture of her mind, but how to map it. You're not haunted, her neurologist had said once during a particularly difficult session. You're a cathedral under renovation. The scaffolding creaks, but it's still sacred space. Some days, Elena believed that. Other days, she felt like a blueprint abandoned mid-design. She no longer trusted herself with the big equations. She hadn't touched a propulsion model or guidance script in over a month. The thought of introducing her fragmented focus into a live system terrified her. She spent her days writing in journals, sketching ideas with blunt pencils, walking endlessly around her apartment with a pencil tucked behind her ear and no intention of using it. But Elon kept showing up. He never made announcements, never asked for updates. Sometimes he brought her articles, cutouts, not links. Print is slower, he'd say. Good for pacing your brain. Other times he brought mechanical puzzles, the kind that required patience, not brilliance. Once he brought her a tiny terrarium, filled with moss and stone, and a single blooming violet. Why this? She asked. It survives in low light, he said. Reminded me of you. She didn't smile, not right away, but the terrarium stayed on her desk. Then came the day he brought the printout. It was late afternoon. The sky outside was all ash and orange. She was curled on her couch in leggings and an oversized hoodie, hair tied back with a pencil through it, flipping absent-mindedly through a notebook filled with half-sentences and scratched-out functions. Elon knocked once and let himself in. He held a folded piece of paper, like it was something fragile. "Reverend, you wrote this," he said simply. She took it and slowly unfolded it. The paper was yellowed and bent in the corners, but the math was hers. Rows of nested variables, velocity arcs, phase correction tables. Familiar but alien. It was dated during one of her worst episodes. "This was buried in a backup folder," Elon said. "You wrote it between breakdowns. No notes, no team input, just pure modeling." She frowned, heart fluttering. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because it worked." She looked up sharply. "This," he continued, tapping the sheet, "redefined our orbital reentry tolerances. We used it in the Ravenna test, and it saved the module." She blinked. "That can't be right. I don't remember writing it." "I know, but it's yours." She looked down again, studying the lines, trying to match the math with the version of herself who had lived in shadows and static. Slowly, her eyes welled. "So I'm still useful." Elon's voice was quiet but firm. "You were never not." Something broke open in her chest. For months, she'd felt like a machine left running too long, glitches in every output, overheating under its own design. She feared that the silence left by the medication meant the genius had been medicated out of her, erased with the whispers. But now, staring at this page, she realized something. The genius hadn't been the hallucinations. It had been hers through them, in spite of them, even if tangled with them. She was still here, still thinking, still capable of reaching into space with just numbers and will. That night, after Elon left, she sat at her kitchen table in the warm, flickering light of the terrarium lamp. Her hands hovered over an empty page in a brand new notebook, a gift from Musk she'd never dared open. Until now. Her fingers trembled, but she uncapped her pen. She didn't know what to write, so she started with this. I can still find the pattern. The next morning, she asked to be reinstated part-time, shadow work only, no deadlines. Musk didn't hesitate. Her new role was advisory, reviewing propulsion models before they hit simulation. She wasn't building yet, but she was seeing, watching. And as she reviewed an intern's overly complicated thrust vector formula, she reached for a red pen and instinctively scratched a correction in the margin. It felt like flying again. Not high, not fast, but forward. The return was not dramatic. There was no single moment of grand re-entry into the world of SpaceX, no standing ovation or splashy announcement. Instead, Elena Reyes stepped quietly into her next chapter. Measured, cautious, self-aware. She no longer wore her old confidence like a cloak. It had become something else now, a quiet resilience stitched together by hard-won insight and a willingness to question even her own brilliance. Musk understood this evolution intuitively. He'd seen others try to rush recovery, to recapture former velocity without adjusting trajectory. Not Elena, not this time. So he redesigned her role. Intentionally broad, flexible, human. Her new position wasn't about performance metrics. It was about perspective. Officially, she was listed under special projects, R&D advisor, team mentor, and internal ethics liaison. Unofficially, she became the company's living reminder that the mind was not just a tool, but a terrain. One to be cultivated, one to be protected. You see things they don't, Elon had told her in one of their first post-recovery meetings, but help them see it without losing themselves. And she did. 3 days a week, she met with junior engineers and theory interns in a glass-walled room they jokingly dubbed the Reyes lair. There were no whiteboards there, no projectors, just soft chairs, a table scattered with puzzles, and a single sign above the door that read, "Trust the signal, question the noise." That phrase became her mantra. She taught problem mapping differently now. Not as a sequence of inputs and outputs, but as a dance between intuition and rigor. She encouraged pauses, meditative resets, walks outside before finalizing a solution. She handed out notebooks without screens, saying, sometimes the brain needs analog space to breathe. She told stories about her own miscalculations, about equations written in dreams, about code she could no longer trust. The interns listened with reverence, not because she had survived something, but because she no longer pretended she hadn't. Her influence rippled across the company culture. Burnout rates dropped among first-year hires. Peer collaboration increased. And a new norm was born, one where asking for help wasn't weakness, but design thinking. Outside the Reyes lair, her contributions to R&D remained razor-sharp, albeit more deliberate. She no longer flooded the system with speculative models. Instead, she curated her ideas like rare minerals, each one pressure-tested, peer-reviewed, and deeply considered. And when she did share a new theory, people paid attention. One such theory, a minor recalibration in fuel distribution to compensate for solar particle drift, seemed too subtle to matter. But it saved the Ether 9 mission from what would have been a critical overcorrection burn. Her voice had returned. Quieter, yes. More careful, but strong. The hallucinations didn't disappear. They never would. The woman with the accent still appeared sometimes, especially in the late hours of modeling when the lab grew quiet. The tapping would return on stormy nights, soft and rhythmic like fingers brushing glass. Once, she caught herself muttering coordinates under her breath that no one had asked for. But she didn't fear them. She didn't follow them either. She listened. She noted. Then she verified. Her mind still operated on dual channels, but now she held the dial. When doubt crept in, when she felt the pressure of being the anomaly again, she would slip into the observation deck overlooking the main launch platform. She'd sit there with a thermos of tea, watching the test rig shimmer in the desert heat, remembering the days when she believed she was transmitting from another reality. Sometimes Elon joined her. They wouldn't talk about work, or recovery, or pressure. Sometimes they didn't talk at all. They'd watch the sun fall behind the horizon like a curtain lowering on another act of their shared theater. One evening, as the wind picked up and the sky dimmed, she turned to him and asked, "Do you think I'm still the same person?" He didn't hesitate. "I think you're the next version." She smiled faintly. "With bugs?" "With patches," he replied. Her laugh was real, deep, unguarded, unexpected. It was that version of Elena that others at SpaceX came to know. Not the mythic mind who once wrote orbital equations in her sleep, but the human who could admit when she needed rest, who asked hard questions, who guided with empathy instead of ego. The Reyes layer was expanded into a program for all new hires, an onboarding experience designed around cognitive wellness, collaborative modeling, and risk-bound innovation. The company quietly credited her in every training deck. Her voice was in the margins of every protocol. And yet, she never claimed the spotlight. She still woke up some mornings with dread. Some nights, she'd hear a whisper and wonder, what if I answered it? But she didn't. She didn't need to, because the signal was stronger now. And when the noise grew too loud, she'd open the page in her journal where Elon's words were scrawled in her own hand. "You're not broken. You're just operating differently." She read it often, not for reassurance, but as a reminder. Her mind had not betrayed her. It had simply evolved. The auditorium wasn't as big as some of the launch halls, but it felt cavernous to Elena. Light spilled down in soft golden hues from a ceiling laced with acoustic panels. The SpaceX internal summit was typically a showcase of propulsion updates, launch strategies, and mission retrospectives, a tightly packed sequence of performance metrics and technical wizardry. But this year, something had shifted. The organizers asked for a keynote that focused not just on numbers, but on navigation. Internal, psychological, the kind of trajectory no software could chart. They asked Elena. It was the first time she'd spoken publicly in over a year. The last time had been during a mission briefing, just before her unraveling. She remembered standing at a similar podium, voice brittle with exhaustion, eyes dancing with shadows she couldn't yet name. That version of her was gone, not erased, but integrated. Now, as she stood backstage, her heart thudded, not with panic, but with gravity. She was ready. She wore a simple navy blue blouse and black slacks. Her hair, loosely tied back, framed a face no longer strained with tension, but sharpened by reflection. Around her wrist was the small silver bracelet Elon had given her months ago, a piece of tech jewelry that pulsed softly when her heart rate rose above a stress threshold. It had remained still the entire morning. When her name was called, she stepped out into the light. The room was full, engineers, analysts, interns, department leads. At the front sat Elon, his expression unreadable, but his posture relaxed. He didn't clap louder than anyone else. He didn't nod dramatically. He simply watched, as if seeing someone he already knew fully now become someone even more. Behind Elena, the first slide glowed into view, a minimalist rendering of a satellite orbit, a single, elegant line bending around a planet's gravitational field. A visual metaphor. The title above it read, "Solving for What You Can't See." She began without ceremony. 2 years ago, I submitted a series of models on orbital decay scenarios. At the time, I believed they were the most important work I'd ever done. A pause. I was wrong. Click. Next slide. A tangled web of handwritten notes, her own, scanned directly from the journals she'd once been afraid to show anyone. The audience leaned in. I wasn't just mapping trajectories, she continued. I was mapping my collapse, and unknowingly my recovery. She told the story with a clarity that surprised even herself. Not melodrama, not confessional, just fact. She spoke of hallucinations as pattern interference, of delusions as recursive logic loops. She described a tap-tap-tap of phantom Morse code. She even mentioned the woman's voice, the one that had once claimed to speak from the future. But more than that, she spoke of what came after, of rebuilding, of debugging, of learning to see one's own thoughts not as absolute truths, but as variables, flawed, fallible, yet still usable when handled with care. Not all variables are visible, she said, standing steady now, her eyes sweeping the room. But we still learn to solve for them. That's what we do. That's what engineers do. We make systems resilient, not by assuming they'll never fail, but by preparing for when they do. Click. Final slide. A clean chart of a redesigned mentorship protocol, applied now in 6 departments across SpaceX, with cross-team feedback loops that reduced burnout by over 40%. No equations, no metaphors, just impact. I didn't return to my old role, she said in closing, because I'm not who I was. But I didn't lose anything. I changed. I learned how to function with the variables, not in spite of them. Silence followed. A deep kind. Then the applause came, not rushed, not perfunctory. It rose like an incoming tide. Elon remained seated a moment longer than the others, arms still crossed. Then, as the crowd stood, he rose too, not as a boss affirming success, but as someone acknowledging another system successfully brought back online. And in that moment, Elena smiled. Not the guarded smile she used in hallways, not the polite one she offered in meetings, but the rare, open smile of someone finally reconnected to herself. She wasn't a miracle. She was a process. A system that had glitched, rebooted, and learned how to run again. Later, as the summit cleared out, junior engineers approached her, not to flatter, but to thank. One said, "I didn't think I could stay in this field. Your story changed that." Another whispered, "You helped me understand my sister better." She answered them with presence. And as the last guest filed out and the stage lights dimmed, Elena stood alone by the edge of the podium, gazing out at the empty rows. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her small notebook, and added a final thought. In systems engineering, we account for drift. Why not in ourselves? And with that, she closed the book. Not because the story was over, but because it was now hers to carry, not be carried by. Elena Reyes didn't return to SpaceX on a wave of cinematic triumph. There were no parades, no speeches, no dramatic background music as she walked the halls. Real life wasn't like that. Healing wasn't like that. Some mornings still came wrapped in fog, like her mind needed extra time to boot, like her thoughts had to load line by line. There were days she opened her laptop and stared at a blank command screen for half an hour before typing anything. And even then, some lines didn't compile. But that was okay, because now she knew how to recognize the lag, not fear it, not fight it. Those were the days she practiced soft starts, a strategy she'd learned in therapy. Make tea, watch clouds, organize cables, do something small and complete. Build momentum, like warming up the engines before a burn. The team around her had changed too, not in personnel, but in posture. No one rushed her anymore. No one expected her to operate at Mach speed. And if someone new didn't understand, they learned quickly. Because Elon never treated her return like a risk or an inconvenience. He made her feel integral, present, trusted. Systems crash, he told her once, tapping a whiteboard with the end of a marker. But they also reboot, sometimes cleaner, smarter. She didn't smile at the time, but she remembered it. Every time she missed a deadline or walked out of a meeting because the overhead lights felt too sharp or the simulations too loud, she would remind herself, reboot, not failure. Elon never coddled her. He never used kid gloves. What he did was worse, better. He kept asking her to show up. One morning, she found a post-it on her monitor. Need you in Raptor brainstorm at 2 p.m. Bring fire. No explanation, no indulgence, just faith. That afternoon, she sat in a room with 6 engineers half her age, all brilliant, all too confident, arguing over load distribution for a new Mars landing module. They talked over each other, interrupted, recalculated. Elena sat back, sipping her coffee, saying nothing, until she saw it, a subtle flaw in their control loop logic. A mathematical echo she recognized from a model she'd once tested in her sleep. "It's looping," she said quietly. "You got a recursion feeding itself and skewing your tolerance range. It won't show in linear tests, but it'll spiral when it hits a live signal." The room went silent. She walked to the board and rewrote the line. The test the next day worked perfectly. When the result came in, clean telemetry, no overcorrection, Elon glanced across the room, met her eye, and nodded once. "Still got it." Elena didn't gloat, didn't laugh. She just leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and said, "I never left. I just rerouted." It became a phrase others started repeating. Reroute became code for creative recovery, for adaptation, for choosing presence over burnout. Engineers started sticking post-its on their desks. Reroute reset. Systems reboot too. Even Elon had one tucked on the edge of his touchscreen workstation. There were still setbacks. Elena missed a high-level strategy meeting one week because she forgot what day it was. She sent the wrong code package to a simulation platform because she misread her own notes. Once, she had a panic attack during a design presentation and had to leave mid-slide. But no one rolled their eyes. No one whispered about fragility. Because when she was clear, she was blazing. And when she wasn't, she was still honest, still thoughtful, still Elena. At night, she would sometimes lie on her couch, watching past launch footage in grayscale, taking slow, deep breaths. She kept her journals nearby, but didn't always write in them. Sometimes she just touched the spine, reminded herself that recovery wasn't a line graph, it was a constellation. On her wall, she had taped a single phrase, written in thick ink. "Stability doesn't mean silence." And she lived by it. Her hallucinations had become more like memories now. They drifted in and out without drama. The voice of the woman, her ghostly, accented guide, now came mostly in dreams, offering ideas that Elena didn't always trust but never feared. She would write them down, label them clearly, from pattern space. And then she'd verify. Always verify. That was the difference now. The system had checks. The mind had mirrors. She'd become her own second engineer. On weekends, she mentored 2 young interns in a virtual sandbox Musk had created for speculative modeling. She taught them how to question their results without doubting their capacity. She told them, genius is great, but stability is what lets you use it. They believed her, because she spoke like someone who had built a launch system out of her own wreckage, and it flew. And every time Elon saw her run a review, or steer a failing prototype back to function, or defuse a tense meeting with one quiet observation, he didn't think of what it had cost. He thought of what it had earned. Rerouted, yes, but never less, never lost. The longer Elena Reyes remained at SpaceX, the less she needed to speak about what she'd overcome, because the building spoke for her. Her presence had become more than symbolic, it had become legendary. New hires, fresh from university programs or poached from rival firms, often whispered about her before they ever met her. Some of the stories were wildly exaggerated. They said she had written propulsion code in her sleep and recited quantum equations backwards during blackout. They spoke of how she once rerouted an entire capsule's guidance system using only a whiteboard and a permanent marker during a power outage. Others said she could read telemetry like sheet music, or that her notebooks were kept in a vault, treated like sacred texts. Elena heard the rumors. She didn't confirm them, but she didn't deny them either. Because somewhere between the facts and the fiction was a truth worth preserving, not about her genius, but about her return. The myth wasn't about what she could calculate, it was about what she survived. And if the myth gave someone hope, if it made a struggling young engineer stay one more day, or ask for help before burnout hit, then let the myths grow. She wasn't chasing credit anymore. She had transcended the need for acknowledgement. Elon understood this better than anyone. He never publicly spoke of her breakdown. There were no emails, no slide decks, no formal recognition. But in private, during one-on-one conversations with engineers who came to him on the verge of collapse, struggling to sleep, paralyzed by imposter syndrome, he would say the same thing. "You know, Elena?" Eyes would widen. Everyone knew the name. She once thought she'd lost everything. Musk would continue. But she built a new launch sequence from the inside out. That sentence, simple as it was, became a kind of company folklore. Elon even used it during a recruitment dinner once, when a promising systems architect from Caltech said she wasn't sure she was mentally strong enough to keep pace with SpaceX. He didn't quote budgets or mission specs. He told her about Elena. Not in full detail, he never violated her trust. Just enough to say, resilience looks different on everyone. But when it shows up, it changes the entire architecture. And Elena had changed everything. She had shifted how SpaceX understood genius. It was no longer the sleepless, caffeinated 90-hour sprint they once praised. It was consistency, honesty, the ability to pause when needed, the courage to return. Her story began to influence internal policies quietly. The company's mental health program, once an afterthought, was redesigned with input from Elena herself. Burnout leaves were normalized. Anonymous check-ins were added to team cycles. And every first-year engineer was now required to attend a 1-hour seminar on cognitive sustainability titled Signal and Noise. Guess who hosted the first session? She didn't need slides. She didn't even write a speech. She just walked in, set a notebook on the table, and said, "I'm not here to talk about recovery. I'm here to talk about function." And sometimes function means knowing when to pause, not just when to launch. The young faces around her froze in quiet awe. One asked, "Did you really dream the Ravenna fix?" Elena smiled gently. "Let's just say, I heard it before I proved it." The room burst into light laughter, but the respect lingered. She hadn't just coded a fix, she had become one. A living reminder that the greatest systems were the ones that could self-repair. Later that week, she found a small folded note on her desk from one of the interns. It read, "I almost quit. Then I read about you. I think I'll reroute instead." She tucked it in the back of her journal, not because she needed validation, but because it was proof. Not of what she'd built, but of what she now allowed others to build through her existence. In the corner of her apartment sat a shelf of mementos. Her original badge, the leather-bound journal from the days of her breakdown, a mechanical keyboard Elon gave her during her recovery, and now, this note. Each object told a version of the same story. She had mapped her mind like Mars terrain, and she had made it home. Not every day was perfect. There were still sleepless nights, still echoes that lingered, but the hallucinations had changed too. They were gentler now, more like unfinished thoughts, lingering in her peripheral awareness. She didn't fight them. She didn't follow them. She simply acknowledged their presence and moved forward, like navigating around space debris, not with fear, but with course correction. That's what she had become. Not a miracle, not a cautionary tale. A navigator. And as the years passed, her legend quietly deepened. One junior engineer once remarked, "It's not just that she sees code, it's that she sees us." They weren't wrong, because somewhere along the line, Elena Reyes stopped being the story and started being the map. The air on the Hawthorne observation deck was crisp that night, the kind of rare California cool that made you feel like the world had tilted just enough to let the stars breathe. Elena stood alone at the railing, arms folded, eyes fixed on the thin plume of vapor that trailed the Falcon launch above. The rocket had just broken through the troposphere, the faint shimmer of its trail slicing clean through the darkness like a comet with intention. The countdown replayed in her mind, not as a memory from screens or headsets, but as something felt. A pulse, a rhythm, not a trigger anymore, not a tripwire, just a pattern. Countdowns had once reminded her of the edge, of the noise, the pressure, the feeling that her mind might implode under one more second of stillness. But now the countdown was a tempo. Familiar, manageable, predictable in the way that only humans and machines can be when they're fully present. Her hands rested on the cool steel railing, knuckles relaxed. Her posture wasn't rigid or poised, it was still. Confident, not in a victorious sense, but in a way that suggested integration. She hadn't defeated anything. She had folded it into her orbit. Behind her, the faint hum of the campus drifted through the air. Distant murmurs from the flight control bay, the occasional echo of laughter from a break room, the low buzz of artificial wind through rooftop vents. But up here on the deck, it felt like she was on a separate layer, above the architecture, above the past. She didn't hear him approach, but she felt him. Elon always walked like he was already halfway through the next task, purposeful even when silent. He didn't greet her, didn't clear his throat, just came to stand beside her, a quiet shape against the steel and night. Together, they watched the rocket fade into the stars. "You ever think it would end like this?" he asked. His voice was low, almost conversational, but she knew better. Elon didn't ask surface-level questions, not of her. When he said end, he meant trajectory, arc, not death, but arrival. She let the question settle. "I used to think I'd break," she said, not flinching, not softening the truth. "Actually, I did. I broke." He didn't respond immediately, just nodded slightly, the way you do when someone finally says something you've been waiting to hear out loud. Then he said, "Yeah, and then you debugged yourself." She laughed, short and real. "Took longer than I thought." He smirked. "Takes longer when you write your own language." They stood there for a long while. The stars above were scattered in impossible patterns, indifferent to the stories humans told about them. Elena had once seen those stars as messages. Now, she saw them as metaphors, still meaningful but not instructive. Not commands. Her mind still scattered thoughts like constellations, still mapped ideas across invisible geometries. But now she could tell the difference between signal and projection. She could live with the patterns, not in them. "I used to think," she said softly, "that I was the glitch, that I was the anomaly the system couldn't handle." "You were," Elon replied, "but now the system runs better because of you." That, she realized, was the kindest thing anyone had ever said to her. He didn't mean SpaceX. He meant the culture, the thinking, the way they treated human cognition not as a liability but as a process, dynamic, layered, sometimes buggy, always evolving. She had become a case study not in fragility, but in recursion, a mind that had rebuilt itself through inspection, not erasure. The rocket had vanished from view, but its trail still faintly glowed, a scar across the sky. "You ever miss the chaos?" Elon asked suddenly, eyes still on the stars. "Which part?" she replied, smirking. "The brilliance inside it." She thought for a moment. "Yes," she admitted, "but I don't miss how it ran me. I'd rather be slower and sovereign than fast and fractured." He nodded again. "That's why I trust you more now." They didn't say anything after that. No follow-up, no wrap-up, just silence, the good kind. The kind that exists between people who don't need to fill the air with certainty. Elena let out a slow breath. The cold kissed her cheeks. Her notebook was back in her apartment, half filled with clean math and messy reflections. She would write in it tonight, not because she needed to prove anything, but because she still loved the architecture of thinking. "Thanks," she said eventually. "For what?" "For standing next to me, even when I couldn't see myself." "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I know," she replied. "That's why it means more." Below them, the lights of the campus blinked like ground-bound stars. Somewhere in a server room, her old velocity model still ran in background simulations. Somewhere in a break room, an intern repeated one of the myths about her writing code in her sleep. Somewhere on a faraway trajectory, a Falcon module flew steady, guided by algorithms born from a mind once thought unstable. And up here on the observation deck, that mind was watching its legacy unfold, not in rocket fire, but in quiet presence. She didn't need applause. She didn't need proof. She just needed the sky. Time moved differently in aerospace. It wasn't measured in days or months, but in missions, iterations, and breakthroughs. Years passed like soft echoes through the hangars and code repositories. Rocket designs evolved, payload capacities improved, telemetry systems got sleeker, faster, more autonomous. But through it all, one piece of foundational architecture remained untouched: Elena Reyes' probabilistic engine for orbital course correction. The algorithm had long since been embedded into flight systems, abstracted into modules, reshaped through new languages, but at its core, her logic still ran. It guided satellites, crewed flights, and interplanetary probes with the same mathematical intuition she'd carved from chaos years ago. Many of the younger engineers didn't even know it was hers. They just referred to it as the Reyes function, unaware that it had been written during a time when its creator had barely been able to trust her own thoughts. Elena never corrected them. Legacy, she believed, wasn't about being remembered, it was about being useful. Elon, however, remembered everything. When he promoted her again, this time to Director of Theoretical Systems, he made the announcement with as little fanfare as possible, just the way she preferred. There was no company-wide memo, no champagne, no speech. He simply walked into her office one afternoon, handed her a new badge, and said, "You've been leading us for a while. This just makes it official." She smiled. "You know I don't care about titles." "I know," he replied, "but the interns do." And they did. Under her new role, Elena began holding closed-session seminars, invite-only, known among junior staff as black box classes. They weren't listed on any calendar. You only got in if you were recommended, or if she personally tapped you on the shoulder and said, "You have questions. Come find some answers." She never taught from slides. She never lectured from a podium. Instead, she used puzzles, fragments of logic chains, damaged code, real-world failures that had been anonymized and repurposed as learning tools. But what truly made her sessions unforgettable was how she taught not just the formulas, but the philosophy behind surviving them. Know your limits, she'd say, but don't let them be your finish lines. Your mind will suggest boundaries that aren't real. Question them. Debug them. It was a different kind of science she offered, a cognitive engineering that acknowledged fear, ambiguity, and failure as part of the system, not bugs to be eliminated. One afternoon, during a seminar about trajectory modeling under incomplete data, a nervous intern raised his hand. He was bright but visibly anxious, eyes darting between his notebook and the table, shoulders stiff with self-doubt. "Can I ask something not technical?" he murmured. Elena nodded. "Please do." He hesitated, then said, "How do you handle fear? Like, not in theory, but actually when it hits you." The room went still. Elena looked at him, eyes kind but serious, and answered slowly, "Same way we handle velocity, one calculated push at a time. You don't conquer fear in one leap. You shift it, bit by bit. You point your vector just a few degrees forward, and you move." The room exhaled. Some took notes. Others just stared, absorbing it like warmth in a cold capsule. Later that day, she found a sticky note on her door. "Thanks for making us human engineers, not just smart ones." She smiled and stuck it inside her notebook. Teaching had become her greatest joy. Not just because she loved equations, but because she loved watching people discover they were more than they believed. Every time a new recruit solved a pattern loop or refactored a recursive trap in code without panicking, it reminded her of her own journey, not of her brilliance, but of her return. She once told Elon during one of their evening walks around the launch pad, "Recovery isn't a detour. It's still part of the mission." He replied, "It's the most complicated system we'll ever build." Sometimes she caught him watching her during strategy meetings, not with concern anymore, but with curiosity, as if he was still learning from her, still studying the variables she lived by. Because Elena didn't just navigate numbers. She navigated people, pressure, fragility. She helped the company not just launch better, but last longer. That year, when the Artemis transfer vehicle was certified for Mars insertion, her team included her name at the bottom of the design spec. Not because she asked them to, because they insisted. And above her signature, someone had added a single line. Survival is a trajectory too. She didn't frame it. She didn't hang it on her wall. She folded the printout and tucked it into the back of her laptop like a compass. Because she knew the next glitch would come, the next crash, the next reboot. Not just for her, but for someone sitting across from her in a meeting, pretending their code was the only thing breaking. And when it did, they'd remember what she said. Not in lecture, not in formulas, but in whispers like this. One push at a time. It started quietly. A late-night blog post she didn't promote. A personal essay drafted at 2 a.m. with a cup of tea in one hand and a memory she could no longer ignore tugging at the other. Elena Reyes had spent so many years wrestling data, diagnosing problems in code and in herself, that she never realized how much she had to say until the words began spilling out, not as equations, but as explanations. Her first piece was titled, Operating While Debugging. It wasn't a technical paper. It wasn't a survival memoir either. It was something in between, an honest reflection on what it meant to think deeply while feeling broken. She posted it under her name, without disclaimers, without legal filters. Within 48 hours, it had over 500,000 views. That's when the invitations started. Conferences, panels, podcasts, university talks. Not about rockets, not even about physics. They wanted her perspective on people, on innovation from the inside out. Her inbox filled with messages from engineers, doctors, artists, and students who had all carried their own storms in silence. Many of them referenced the same quote, "Know your limits. Don't let them be your finish lines." But Elena didn't want to become a mental health figurehead. She didn't want to be reduced to the woman who broke and came back. What mattered to her was context. That people understood this wasn't about overcoming, it was about integrating, rebuilding, iterating. So she wrote more. Short essays, scattered with anecdotes from her time in recovery. Observations about cognitive architecture. Notes on hallucinations that, while still appearing, had become benign, no more threatening than forgotten dreams. She shared how her notebooks weren't just filled with math, but with questions, self-checks, logic trails, and emotional breadcrumbs. In every interview, every talk, she credited the systems around her. But one name came up more often than others, Musk. Not because he saved her. She made that very clear. "Elon didn't rescue me," she said during an NPR interview one afternoon, her voice steady and warm. "He upgraded the platform I was running on." The host laughed. The audience chuckled. But Elon didn't. He was in the studio, off mic, watching through the glass. When she said those words, he simply nodded, quietly, solemnly, because he understood. He hadn't swooped in with a cape. He hadn't imposed a cure. What he gave her was something harder, stability without suffocation. He gave her room to rebuild without retreating. He gave her friction when she needed challenge, silence when she needed space. And that nuance, that refusal to make her story into a simple redemption arc, that was why they still worked so well together. Their bond had shifted over time. It wasn't just boss and engineer. It wasn't mentor and mentee. It had become something more elemental, a shared frequency. They saw each other as outliers, not because of status or IQ, but because of how they thought, systemically, recursively, with an unshakable instinct to map chaos into structure. During private meetings, Elon still asked her opinion first, even when the room was full of experts. Not just about code, but about tone. He once asked before a big company keynote, "Does this language encourage resilience or just demand it?" Elena had smiled. "Encourage it. Always." And so it was. Her influence on SpaceX extended far beyond theoretical systems now. Internal documentation was rewritten with clarity in mind. Break rooms were redesigned for mental resets. Project timelines were adjusted to include compression relief windows, moments in long cycles where reflection, not just acceleration, was the goal. One internal Slack channel, titled #BuildBold, became a safe space for engineers to share doubts, breakthroughs, and burnout warnings. The pinned message read, "You're not weak for pausing. You're wise. You are." Elena never asked for credit. She didn't care if her name was cited. What mattered was implementation, infrastructure, culture, because she remembered what it felt like to believe that brilliance meant breaking. And she wasn't going to let that myth survive on her watch. Outside of SpaceX, her visibility grew. She appeared on TEDx stages, spoke at MIT, was invited to consult for NASA's Human Factors team. But no matter where she traveled, she always came home to Hawthorne, to her desk near the far wall of the theoretical systems wing, where her plant still sat, growing quietly. She kept her schedule light, on purpose. One major project at a time. One deep mentorship rotation per quarter. She didn't rush anymore. She didn't fill her plate to prove she was back. She knew she was back, because she could now say no without fear of becoming invisible again. One afternoon, after a seminar on recursive modeling and human cognition, a young engineer asked her, "How do you keep your mind clear with so much input?" Elena replied, "I don't keep it clear. I keep it aligned. Clarity comes and goes. Alignment is a practice." That sentence ended up on a mug in the company gift shop. She laughed when she saw it, but bought one anyway, because she knew that every mug, every slide quote, every whispered story of the woman who saw code in her dreams helped crack the illusion that tech had to be cold. That precision had to be cruel. That genius meant solitude. She had rewritten her system. And in doing so, she hadn't just upgraded herself. She'd upgraded the entire environment, from the inside out. The amphitheater at SpaceX's Red Dunes campus near the Mojave Desert had never been so full. 1,000 employees gathered under the stars, surrounded by subtle, ambient lighting and large curved LED displays that showed archived footage from the historic Mars cargo missions. Engineers, analysts, test pilots, interns, and guests sat shoulder to shoulder, many wearing commemorative pins or shirts printed with the mission patch of the first successful cargo landing on Mars. It was the 20th anniversary of that launch, a moment etched into aerospace history when a red streak across the sky became the beginning of something bolder than belief. People had come to celebrate milestones, fuel innovations, modular habitat delivery, oxygen extraction units now thriving in Martian soil. But beneath all of that was something quieter, more profound. Elon Musk walked onto the stage without fanfare. No lasers, no theme music, just a black blazer, a white shirt, and a stillness that only came when he had something personal to say. "We measure success," he began, his voice clear through the cool night air, "in kilometers traveled, payloads delivered, and data collected. We track metrics. We optimize for impact." A pause. "But sometimes," he continued, "the most important success isn't what we launch into space. It's who we bring back to Earth." He turned his head slightly, just enough to let the spotlight follow his gaze. The audience did too. In the front row, seated between a propulsion specialist and a neuroadaptive interface engineer, was Dr. Elena Reyes. Her hair was pinned back simply, her face illuminated by the soft lighting that danced off the stage screens. She wore a slate gray suit, understated and elegant. Her expression was unreadable to most, a calm that seemed impenetrable. But those who knew her recognized the fullness behind her eyes, the slight curl of her lip, the rise and fall of her breath. She didn't blink as the cameras turned to her. She didn't wave. She simply nodded once, acknowledging what the moment truly was, not a coronation, but a reconciliation. Applause broke across the amphitheater, like wind finding its way through a canyon. Long sustained, not performative, not obligatory. It was the kind of applause that comes from people who had walked with her or learned from her, even if they'd never spoken to her directly. Because by now, everyone at SpaceX knew the truth. Elena Reyes was no longer just a systems director. She wasn't just a recovering genius or the architect of a legendary logic engine. She had become something less defined but more essential. She was the soul of the program. That night, back in her hotel room on the second floor of the guest wing, Elena sat cross-legged on the edge of the bed, her shoes off, her blazer folded over the chair. The sky outside her window was pitch black, scattered with stars and far-off satellites that blinked like breathing lights. Beside her, on the nightstand, was a journal. Not one of her new ones, sleek, grid-lined, leather-bound. This was an old one, the original, the one she had nearly burned. The cover was worn, the edges curled. Some pages stuck together, others had faint water stains from coffee or tears. Her handwriting back then was sharper, more erratic. Equations filled the margins. Between them were fragments of fear. What is real? Who can I tell? Am I the problem or the program? She turned the pages slowly. She didn't cringe. She didn't flinch. She smiled. Not because she had beaten it. The condition, the delusions, the circuitry her mind insisted on forming in patterns no one else could see. That part never vanished completely. She still woke some mornings feeling scrambled. Still caught herself drawing symbols she didn't consciously understand. But she'd learned to live with it, to reroute, to recover, to rebuild. Not by discarding the old system, but by upgrading it slowly, patch by patch. Like any legacy architecture, her mind wasn't perfect, but it was strong, adaptive, and still capable of wonder. She closed the journal and placed her hand on top of it for a moment, not as a farewell, as a thank you. The past had been a cruel instructor, but also an honest one. She reached for her glasses, placed them on the desk, and turned off the lamp. In the dark, the only sound was the soft hum of the air vent and the barely audible ping of a system diagnostic completing on her tablet. Somewhere out there above Mars or orbiting Earth, her logic still guided vessels through vacuum. Her algorithms still nudged thrusters just enough to avoid chaos. Her influence pulsed through hundreds of systems. But tonight, she wasn't thinking about that. She was thinking about the fact that she had come back. From collapse, from uncertainty, from silence, and not alone. Musk had never told her what to do. That had made all the difference. He didn't rescue her. He had simply believed in her enough to wait. And in that waiting, she had found her way back. Not into the same coordinates, but into the same mission, with an entirely different map. In the quiet rhythm of her Pasadena apartment, far from mission briefings and launch protocols, Dr. Elena Reyes had created a sanctuary. The walls no longer echoed with frenzied scrawls. There were no ceiling-to-floor formulas, no coded hallucinations looped in sharp ink. Now her home was calm, deliberate, each item chosen for meaning, not memory overload. Her office, in particular, had undergone a transformation. The once chaotic nerve center where she'd once mapped not only trajectories but episodes of disassociation had become a place of soft order. A clean white desk sat beneath the window, flanked by a pair of tall bookshelves filled not just with physics texts, but poetry, psychology, and art history. On the wall to her left, a corkboard held pinned note cards, each bearing a quiet truth: hold system errors with grace. Not everything broken needs fixing. Some patterns are meant to be companions, not instructions. And above all, one mantra she had written and rewritten since her recovery began: keep compiling. Near her desk sat a single floating shelf, her curated archive, as she half-jokingly called it. On it, carefully arranged like museum pieces, were 3 objects that never left her side: the original spiral-bound journal from room 11A, its pages still slightly warped from nervous sweat and years of hard travel, the yellowing Falcon schematic she had annotated the night of her breakthrough, and 3 small amber pill bottles, their labels removed and replaced with hand-lettered white tape. Stability, stillness. Start again. Elena never dusted them casually. She didn't display them for others. But they were there, quietly witnessing her return each day to the work of being. Some mornings were still slow boots, those days where cognition felt like old hardware running on limited RAM. She would sit at the edge of her bed, sipping tea, listening to the wind cut between the window panes. No panic, just patience. A knowledge now etched in her core: not all errors are fatal. One Tuesday evening, after finishing a round of asynchronous mentoring reviews for SpaceX's newest resilience cohort, she settled into her favorite chair by the window. The sky was cloudless. Lights from the hills pulsed like heartbeat monitors. She opened her laptop to read a paper on recursive neural networks, but paused when a soft chime indicated a new message. She glanced at the subject line, "Thank you." At first, she assumed it was another generic email from a podcast listener or someone who had seen her TEDx talk. But the name in the sender field gave her pause. Familiar. She clicked. The message was short, barely a paragraph. "Hi, Dr. Reyes. You probably don't remember me, but I was in your mentorship cohort 3 years ago. Today I got a diagnosis, bipolar I. I spent the first hour after crying. And then I thought of you. Not because of your brilliance, but because of your honesty. You made complexity feel like something you could live inside. Thank you for making me feel possible." Elena sat back. The words washed over her like a tide. Not validation, she didn't need that anymore. Not pride, just recognition. This was the invisible yield of her years of emotional excavation. The code she'd once written into herself wasn't just helping her run, it had gone open source. She closed her eyes. The hum of her air filter, the tick of her minimalist clock, the gentle pressure of a laptop's weight on her knees, all real, all present. She stood and walked to her desk. Her hand hovered above the journal. She opened it. Inside were 2 decades of entries. She flipped past the ones written in fragments of delusion, the ones filled with dark spirals and cryptic symbols. She reached a blank page. She wrote, "Possibility doesn't require clarity. It only asks for permission." Then, beneath it, "Keep compiling." She closed the journal, breathing steadily. This wasn't a cinematic moment. There was no swelling score. Just the quiet pulse of continuity, a life still running, still debugging, still showing up for the day-to-day maintenance of identity. Later, before bed, she composed a reply to the mentee. "I do remember you, not by name, but by the question you once asked. What if I'm not as strong as I need to be? My answer now is the same. You don't need to be strong. You need to be consistent. Keep compiling. With care. You are." She hit send and closed her laptop. The room was dark now, lit only by the faint street lamp glow filtering through the curtains. She turned, glancing once more at the shelf, the journal, the schematic, the empty bottles. Artifacts of her crash, symbols of her patch, proof that recovery didn't mean returning to the previous version. It meant staying online long enough to write the next one. And she was still writing. The old bench still stood where it always had, along a narrow concrete path lined with jacaranda trees just beginning to bloom. Their lavender petals drifted lazily through the air like fragments of thought, scattering across the ground in quiet, elegant disarray. The bench creaked slightly as Elena sat, its wood worn smooth by time, softened by weather and by the weight of memories. She hadn't visited this spot in years. But her feet had brought her here almost unconsciously, retracing the loop from her early days at SpaceX, from the long walks she used to take when her mind was overloaded, fractured, or in freefall. It was on this very bench that she had once scribbled into her notebook with trembling hands, frantic symbols, partial vectors, half-sensical equations that felt urgent at the time, but were, in retrospect, the language of a system under distress. Now, years later, her steps were slower, her hands steadier, her thoughts no less complex, but no longer consuming her. The city buzzed faintly behind her, but here it was quiet enough to hear the wind thread through the branches, to feel time pass without the need to measure it in seconds or schedules. She carried her journal with her, though it was newer than the one from those early days. This one had clean edges, thick pages, and a cover that read, embossed in silver, "Build from the inside out." She ran her fingers over the cover for a moment, then opened it, not to write, but to remember. To flip through sketches, notes, lessons, quotes from conversations that had shaped her recovery and her return. Each page was its own timestamp in a language she now knew fluently, the language of lived resilience. Her phone buzzed. She didn't check it right away. But when she did, her smile came slowly and without hesitation. It was a message from Elon. Just a single line. Still got the spark. She tapped out her reply in seconds. Always. Just running a deeper protocol now. There was no need for more. No need to explain. He'd understand exactly what that meant. Their relationship had evolved far past the transactional or even the collaborative. They were, in some strange way, parallel systems, running separate processes, occasionally syncing, always learning from one another's glitches and updates. Elena set the phone beside her on the bench and looked up at the sky. It was wide and familiar, a soft watercolor of early dusk. She followed the invisible line of a satellite overhead, then another, and then traced a diagonal path across the horizon, old habits dying slowly, like constellations fading into atmosphere. She thought of how far she had come, not just in kilometers or in career, not just in accolades or algorithms, but through herself. She remembered the moment she had first called herself broken, alone in a server room at 2 a.m., whispering it like a confession to the cooling fans, "I am a corrupted file." And how much time it had taken to understand that the truth was more layered, more human. She had not been corrupted. She had been overwhelmed. She had not crashed. She had overflowed. And what she did next, what mattered most, was not to erase or rewrite herself, but to refactor, to make space for the chaos, to create fail-safes, to loop back into herself without losing the core that made her a builder in the first place. That was her greatest code, her most elegant system, not the Reyes correction protocol, now used in Mars orbit adjustments, not the deep variable index that had revolutionized solar trajectory mapping, but this, the willingness to stay online through error, the decision to keep compiling. Her final commit had nothing to do with launch windows or clean datasets. It was not found in a technical paper or an equation etched into a whiteboard. It lived in moments like these. In the steady breath she took under an open sky. In the message from a former mentee who had once whispered, "You made me feel possible." In the unopened email thread labeled, "Keep compiling," peer mentoring responses. In the worn spine of her old notebook. In the shelf at home where her first pill bottle sat labeled "Stability." In the quiet kitchen where her tea steeped every morning before dawn. It lived in the way she could now listen to silence without fear. She looked down the path and saw a younger woman walking past in a SpaceX hoodie, likely one of the new cohort engineers. She had earbuds in and a tablet tucked under her arm, looking lost in thought, maybe halfway through a tough simulation or a long night of code review. Elena watched her pass and felt a tenderness in her chest, not nostalgia, but kinship. Because that girl would never know the exact fires Elena had walked through. But she would know pressure. She would know the feeling of reaching a breaking point and wondering if stepping away meant failure. And maybe, just maybe, she'd find one of Elena's mantras on a Slack channel, or an echo of her story in a lunchroom conversation, or her voice in a training video about system logic and mental health. Maybe she'd read Elena's story one day and realize that survival wasn't a retreat. It was an architecture. It was a loop, a build, a launch sequence written from inside out. Elena took one last look at the sky. The stars hadn't come out yet, but she knew they were there. Like backups, like guides. She picked up her phone and typed one more line in her journal app. Final commit, belief in broken things that still fly. She stood, not fast, not slow, just certain, because the system she had built inside herself didn't need validation anymore. It ran, and it ran well. Before we close, if something in Elena's journey spoke to you, if a moment, a line, or a page from her story stayed with you, drop it in the comments. We'd love to know what part hit home for you. And tell us, where in the world are you watching from? It's always powerful to see just how far these stories travel. You never know, your comment might be the spark someone else needed today.